Okay, so what I'm about to expose here might trigger a lot of people, and it's up to you whether you want to accept it as truth or not. But from my experiences, what I have concluded when it comes to attraction and making decisions in regards also to relationships, specifically romantic relationships, is that typically somebody who is at a very high state of consciousness might attract somebody who is at a very low state of consciousness, right? So like light attracting darkness. And what happens is when these two individuals meet, that person who is gravitating at a super high, super high, super amazing state of bliss and excitement, they're gonna see the other person as love. And they will always see that person as love as long as that other person doesn't start reflecting, projecting negativity upon that person. So that person who is at a really high state of frequency, that light might be strong enough to overcome the negativity of the other person, yes. But sometimes that light cannot hold the amount of darkness that is receiving, because if you're not creating enough light to overcome the darkness, and that person who is at a state of darkness or at a really low state of consciousness is not supporting that person who is at a high state, then that person who is at a high state essentially is going to go down. Yeah. So I've concluded that most of the times, like the worst decisions I have made in my life was when I was at a state of despair, at a really low state of fear, of sadness, and I obviously end up attracting a person who could also mirror that state of consciousness, but who would still be able to collaborate with me at the situation, right? Like in terms of business needs, or in, for example, finding a place. For me, there was always this point that I would find myself of despair of like not having a place to go, and I would attract a person who had, you know, resources, who had a home, and we would try to work together. Obviously, that person was not thinking of these things when they would meet me, because they were just like focused on the goal of like, well, I want to rent out this place, I want some money, and I can also help somebody else, right? Unfortunately, I ended up going through hell in this situation. All the time I would see myself at a place of scarcity and despair. I would end up making choices based on that frequency and going on that road of like, attracting things that were even lower than the original state I was found at. Um, and I only realized that later after the experience. So I don't blame myself for that, because it's all a learning curve. We're all doing the best we can, right? That famous way of saying like we're always doing the best we can at the level of frequency, at the state of consciousness we have found. But when it comes to romantic relationships, this is really interesting, yeah, because I've noticed that there are three scenarios that now I want to become more aware of it. The first scenario, like I just said, is when that high state of consciousness individual meets another individual who is in a low state of consciousness. There's a level of willingness of that person who is at a low state of consciousness to want to match or come up high with that person who is at a higher state of consciousness. If there's no willingness, if there's just like pleasure or satisfaction in the moment, because that person who is in darkness is contaminated, it's like feeling that excitement and the energy and that bliss of that person who is at a high state of consciousness, they obviously gonna want to stay with you for some time, but essentially they're gonna show their truth. And when they show their truth, and it's coming from fear, from grief, from sadness, from disappointment, and all those like low emotions, and they are creating like situations and moments to also lower the state of consciousness of the other person. Let's say, somebody who's very loving and they always see love, they start seeing the other person like unloving actions, or unloving words, or the truth is coming up. And essentially, if you don't have enough awareness at the moment to leave the situation and understand that that person is just gonna be sucking the most they can of you and making you feel upset because they wanna bring you down to that level of consciousness they are, you're gonna essentially come back down. And I'm saying come back down because like before you reach that state of consciousness, that high state of consciousness that I call unconditional love or heaven, you probably have gone through enough hell and you did so much to bring yourself to a higher place until you realize that you could see and love everybody for who they are. But yeah, you need to maintain strong boundaries to protect your peace, to protect your temple or this place you call heaven or those like higher state of consciousness, so your bliss, your light. So when there's willingness from that person who is at a low state to do the best and feel inspired by your actions and your words and do the best they can to reach your state, then yes, the relationship might work perfect because that person who is helping you is also feeling good about serving somebody else. But when there's no willingness, and this is what happens a lot of the times, like somebody who is at a really high frequency will attract somebody who has no awareness of what you had done to reach this place, or is used to the home frequency, and if that home frequency for them is always being low and living at that place of like, oh, I'm stable, I'm always this, I'm never too happy or I'm never too sad, well, that's because you're not in touch with your emotions. But when you start to get in touch with your emotions and you start to understand that you ultimately have to change how you think, how you feel, and how you act, and you're not ready to embody this way of living in order to reach those higher states, in order to kind of grow together with the other person you're with, then that relationship falls downhill because there's a level of attachment that is created on the highs that the other person brings to you. And that person who is at a high state also creates an attachment to um always like going down and going back up, and that is an addiction, like at a brain level that we don't need to explain and go further, but I know what it is because I went through that. And ultimately that relationship doesn't work out because you are creating sadness and disappointment and some negative and a lot of negative emotions and a lot of negative feelings with the other person. And who do you think is going to pay the price for all of it? Both souls or the soul who feels the most? I would say both, but the one who is more in contact and more in touch with their feelings, with their truth, will feel more because the person who's not willing to sacrifice the authenticity in order to just to put out a mask and pretend to be something they're not. And it is easy to pretend who you're not, right? Because like you can just always fake you are happy. You can always fake like you can always try to match like the frequency of the other person you meet and just kind of go with that flow, but you're not ultimately coming from that place of authenticity. And when it comes to following your bliss and coming from authenticity, you gotta do the work it takes to go deeper down into your emotions, into your feelings, and ultimately be able to start going up higher. Because when you start to realize that what you say to yourself affects your frequency, what you do to others affects your frequency, then you realize that it's a commitment that you have to make to life. You always have to be kind. You always have to say nice things. You always have to respect and see each other as yourself, because everything is yourself. That field is always you. You bring it with you anywhere you go. It's kind of like your home. And it's so interesting, right? Like you can bring your home to anywhere in the world. Like I lived in 10 countries last year, and I basically brought my home to all these different places, to all the homes of the people who I stayed with. That's another conversation. We're gonna focus on those three scenarios here that I'm exposing to you. So the other two scenarios I would say is when two people are very low at a level of frequency, and they still can have a lot of compassion for one another, even though they're resonating at a level of like sadness, despair, fear, and suffering. But when they still have hope that the other person who's going through what they're going through can help themselves. So typically this happens when there are similarities in terms of like interests or something they can do together that can help them get out of the situation. So these souls will match, they will gravitate towards each other, and they will commit to get themselves out of the situation. So typically the level of willingness there is really high. Yeah. So we talked about the first scenario is like there's no willingness, and that usually sacrifices the person who is at a high state, because that person will go down if they don't have strong boundaries and they are not creating enough light to overcome the darkness, and they're not feeling like the partner is being supportive towards that expansion. But the second scenario, two people are low, but they have that willingness to expand together based on a similar interest, a similar goal, a similar passion, and they have enough pain that is driving them towards something greater or out of that situation. Yeah. The other scenario I would say is when one individual is at a really high state of consciousness and another individual is at a very low state of consciousness, and they are willing to listen, to understand, to commit to new hobbies, new practices, new actions in order to meet that person at a high state of frequency, because they understand something better than what they have tried before, for what they have lived for, and they're tired of living at that state. So now they want to, pursue a creative path. They want to be in alignment, like, and be meaning. They want to start to embody those aspects of themselves that they have left for so long, and they're willing to sacrifice the discomfort that comes from, sometimes if the woman is the one who is at a high state, like that man might feel a lot sometimes for seeing that they have to listen and follow the guidance of a woman. But again, you guys, we all have male and female energies. So if the woman who is at a high state has higher um has a resonates, vibrates at a higher state of consciousness in both female and male polarities, and that man is not gravitating in that frequency, then the man has to sacrifice, the ego and the pride to follow that woman. And I know it's not easy, because I have tried that. I've gone through that path, and oh, that is also for another conversation, or you can also read one of my books where I kind of bridge this relationship like further and deeper. But yeah, so when there is a willingness from that person in terms of like, well, I want to try new hobbies, I want to try to do what this girl does to get to her place, because one, I love her, two, I want to love myself, three, I have tried both polarities, light and darkness, and I like the light more. Yes. However, a lot of the times it's hard for the brain to get used to something they haven't been conditioned to for so long. So that's when we get into science, into the biology of things, and for an entity to sacrifice the low state, like what they used to feel for so many decades, or who knows, incarnations, in order to just to like meet somebody who's always higher, it's kind of tough. And that's when, things begin to fall down, and they're going to use enough logic and reason to say, well, it's your fault. Usually somebody who is at a low state, they're not really connected to the emotions. So they're pretty good at creating things in their minds and like putting words together and showing like facts and reason and logic to um win a battle, right? A battle, I mean, like a discussion or between both parties, men and women. So my tip to you is always be aware of where you're leading to. Where, what in this relationship are you attracted to the most? Like, if you're always happy and you have reached that state of bliss, and you feel like you're ready to give unconditionally to another person, you want to still rate your level of willingness to sacrifice your peace for the love of this other person. Like, is it really worthy to do what you are willing to do and what you're willing to lose at some times in order to be with that person? Or are you doing this because you're actually trying to meet a need internally? Are you actually doing this to also feel another aspect of you that hasn't reached that state of unconditional love yet, that is being maybe mirrored in the other person? This is also something that might happen. It is possible that an individual can reach unconditional love and still have parts of themselves that haven't met this frequency, and they're just like parts of themselves that are repressed. In other words, they're just like, I don't need this. Like, I can just bury down and just always follow my bliss and always just show up as this happy, incredible individual. So sometimes life will bring a person to you that is at a low state because they're giving you the opportunity to, like, well, maybe it's time for you to embody also this part of you and try to bring this part of you up and higher. If you have the tools to do that and you have the willingness, it's worth it. Because now we're talking about expansion, like your expansion, the expansion of the other person, and the expansion of humanity ultimately, because it is contagious, like you doing for somebody else is influencing other people to do something for somebody else as well. But when you feel like it's not really you meeting any like sense of lack internally, but it's basically you just wanting to do for that person because you see so much in that person because you really have access parts of themselves that you haven't before, and you are only able to access those parts of yourself through that person, and that's like making you feel more expensive as a light being and even more um as the true soul that you are. Yes, it is worthy to kind of go with that person and understand that it's not always going to be high. There will be moments where you're gonna feel low, but there will be times when that person's gonna make you feel even higher. So the question is, how do you measure whether there are more highs and lows? And this is something like a lot of couples, a lot of people who also have gone through relationships like me, that you experience ups and downs, they could never tell like if there were more ups or more downs. I think the way to measure there is based on your outcomes and your outputs in life. So yes, the internal state is something you want to measure also. Like, let's say in a week, if you feel like only good one time of only like two times of the week and the other days is always shitty, then obviously this is not like the kind of relationship. Like if you're not seeing progress in the other person, if the other person is not seeing that you are adding enough to them and helping them to make progress and get out of that place, then it's pointless. Then you gotta move on, go back to your bliss and let that person continue to flow along, and ultimately they will find somebody who is the right match. Another way to measure that, like I said, your outputs is basically like, what are you guys attracting on a daily basis? Do you feel like you're doing things together that is influencing the ascension of humanity, that is actually helping the word in any way? Like, oh, I'm saving the word with this person because we are creating beautiful things together, because we're working on projects together, even though we go through these things internally and we have all these issues that we are struggling with and we're healing together, we're still able to manage our times well and are able to serve others, through love, through compassion, through our talents, through our skills. But again, if the outcome hasn't been very much positive and you guys don't see any progress out of this union, why bother? Just leave. It's time to move on. So this is when you have to break free the addiction feeling, the attachment that you both crave, and both souls have to go their own. It's gonna hurt in the beginning, I know, because it felt extremely painful for me too. The three relationships I've had where I felt extremely expensive, and I was able to access like even higher states of consciousness for the other individual, who would access to higher places and would access like really low places. I could never tell if I was accessing those low places because I was tied in and completely united with the other individual, or it was because they were reflecting a place in myself that was really low too. um Again, like these two souls, when they get together, they start to eat one another. It sounds kind of crashy or trashy, or I don't know how you would call this way of me explaining like how it sounds a little like, yeah, But like the eating, it's kind of like, these two animals, they eating one another. It's kind of like, you smell delicious. Let me inhale all of that because it feels good. And it's the same for their, like for both parties. It's kind of like, that chemistry when it happens when you meet somebody else and you call it love, it's ultimately these two individuals like sucking from each other. Like they're feeling good about each other. It's like I inhale this and I exhale this and it feels good because I only feels good when I'm with you. And I need you to be in front of me for me to get this high. So it sounds kind of crazy, especially when you have gone through the path and you find yourself at a certain place of awareness and you start to realize how crazy romantic love is. And I still have parts of me that were attached to that place. And I always have to pick it up back. It's kind of like I have to remind myself all the time, like, oh, it's kind of like I experience like this moment of like, oh, it felt so good at that time. And it's like a feeling that goes really fast and you are not even aware of what's playing out in your heart, right? Because you're too much in your mind. And that feeling just goes like, oh, it felt so good with that person. Those highs, like I need somebody like to access that state again. And then boom, you go on hunting for that person. And then awareness comes up and like, hey, do you remember like actually how this really works? And you're like, oh shit, this is how it works. Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't need this anymore. Oh my gosh. And it sucks because like maybe you found that person and you started engaging with them and they started like feeling hopeful about you just to realize that you don't want that. And then you make somebody feel bad because it's kind of like, wow, maybe she didn't like me. Maybe she didn't think I was attractive enough or whatever. I mean, that's also their problem. Like, you don't have to take a responsibility of how somebody responds to the things you do. However, you do have to be mindful the law of karma will still apply to what you put on, you get out. Yeah. So if you hurt somebody at a level of like, giving them hopes that you can make something work with them and then you just like disappear, it's kind of like maybe life is going to do the same for you if you let it. Because maybe if you really don't need somebody else to appear in your life, you're not even going to give space to life to bring this back into your path, right? When you start to really dive deeper and deeper with your feelings and your emotions and recognize the patterns and the feelings, it's not like you're going to be obsessed all the time about what you're doing and like control freak, but you're just going to be more aware of that and you'll be able to respond better to the situations that are kind of like throwing you plate. So be mindful, my friend. I feel like I've thrown a lot to you there, and I hope you are able to discern better moving forward, whether you want to proceed with somebody and what is that relationship dynamics playing like in terms of the attraction. What is it attracting this person to me? What am I attracting this person? And what is the level of willingness to both individuals in when it comes to making this work? Yeah, it's a dance. It's a light in the darkness. So let's just face it. You gotta figure out if that person's gonna create more light with you, or if the two individuals are gonna create more darkness. The world needs more light. So essentially, God, this higher power, the supreme force within everyone, wants you to create more light, wants you to expand. Because God is love. God wants more love. So I hope you find a match, a partner who is also willing to create more love with you and that gravitates as high as you do. And both of you can expand together and make the most beautiful relationship of your life. Thank you.